Hi, I'm Janet McFarland, the real estate reporter for the Globe and Mail, and I'm here with Bill Soper, CEO of Royal LePage. We're here to talk about the Bank of Canada's decision yesterday to raise interest rates, and at the same time to talk about Royal LePage's new housing market forecast for all markets across Canada. So, Bank of Canada yesterday raised interest rates for the first time in 7 years. Today, we're here to talk about what that means for you, and what we're going to do is we're going to take your questions during this live chat. So if you have any questions, simply leave them in the comments below and we'll get to as many as we can. So let's dive right in. Phil,
sure.
This was only a quarter-point rate increase. What do you think that means for the housing market?
Standalone, 25 basis points or a quarter point isn't going to have a big impact on the housing market. However, these things are additive. Last year we had the federal government put some tightening around the rules restricting the access to insured mortgages. And then in Ontario and British Columbia, we've had provincial governments enact additional measures aimed at slowing the Toronto and Vancouver housing markets. You add to that a bump in the cost of money, and these things start to pile up on each other. So the bottom line is it's much better for the Toronto market, which was irrationally exuberant for most of the last year, and we should see it begin to slow down. I don't think it will have a material impact on markets like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada, where affordability is pretty darn good. It's much different than it is in Toronto and Vancouver.
So in the Toronto market, let's talk about Toronto for
Sure,
just a second.
sure.
Toronto has already seen some slowing. May sales were down in May, sales were down in June. It's a slowing down trend. So do you think that, what are you anticipating for the rest of the year, for the second half of the year for the Toronto market?
So when we look at the Toronto market and in the Royal LePage House Price Survey that was just released, we see that home prices are up a whopping 24% year over year, which is hardly moderate, right? It's very extreme. But if you peel back the covers, you see that the transaction count, the number of homes trading hands, is dropping. In fact, we're down about a third from the peak, and prices peaked in about the April time frame. So we are seeing the market begin to slow. Our outlook for the full year for Toronto is up 18%. But what does that mean? We hit the midpoint of the year at 24. We're going to end at 18. It means the back half of the year is below that 18% number. So prices will be, in relative terms, flat in the second half of the year for Toronto if all unfolds as we expect.
So let me ask you about our other biggest housing market in Canada, that's Vancouver.
Yeah.
Vancouver's seen a different trend. Vancouver has actually been coming back. We've seen prices start to climb late this spring. So what do you think about Vancouver for the rest of the year?
Well, in the house price composite, quarter over quarter, so that's the last 3 months that we've been through, we see prices up 2%. That is a marvelous change to the ridiculous 30% numbers we were seeing back in 2015 in the early part of last year. But it's also a little bit of foreshadowing for what we might see in Toronto. Vancouver is a much twitchier market than Toronto is. It's much smaller, about 40% of the size, and homes are much more expensive. If you look at our composite, they're a full 50% higher in Vancouver. So you get smaller market, much more expensive, and you have the impact of foreign investors that's roughly double in the really high concentrated areas. All those things add risk to the market, and yet we were able to go through this last year with a drop in the number of homes trading, but home prices have held on. So it's protected people's personal balance sheets, we say, which means their net worth has been protected, which is a good thing for consumer confidence.
Absolutely. So second half of the year in Vancouver, you're thinking a slight increase?
You know what? Flat. It's a flat year. Our full year forecast is that we'll end the year about where we did at the end of last year.
Okay.
So I've got a question from the audience. Khalid Alazuki Kuzi would like to know, why is Royal LePage forecasting increased real estate prices when we're seeing increased foreclosures and decreasing prices over the last few months? What are they seeing that everybody else isn't?
So the foreclosure rate in Canada is at near an all-time low. We're actually quite a bit better in terms of defaults on mortgages than we were back in the 2000s. Through the financial crisis, which people who pay attention to these sort of things would know lasted here, a year or two around 2009 and 10, but globally was 5 or 6 years long. We did see foreclosures bump up a little bit, but banks have been very, very careful since then in their lending practices. So foreclosures are actually very low. And the amount of equity people have in their homes is at an all-time high. In Canada, it averages about 75% across the board. So in terms of the risk on that side, we're in very, very good shape. In preparation for exactly what's happening, which is a turn in the market, the banks wanted to be prepared. They wanted to make sure that there wasn't excess risk in the marketplace. On the pricing, in a typical year, home prices peak in the spring. So April or May is when the volume of homes, most homes are sold in Canada, and on average, that's the highest price point in the year. So we would expect June, July, August prices to be below that April peak. What we expect as we go forward, say to a year from now, at the end of the second quarter of 2018, is that home prices won't be up 24% like they were versus 2016, but they'll still be up. It's really rare. Even in Vancouver, which I explained earlier, it was a much twitchier and more difficult market with very high prices. Home prices have crept up 2%. So my expectation this time next year, we'll be looking at a high single digit in Toronto. The fact is, we've got people moving here from around the world and across the country, moving to Southern Ontario because the jobs are here. And it's hard for our builders to keep up the supply of homes. So we have almost a chronic undersupply of places for people to live.
So can I ask you about this? If you're in the market today to buy a new home, there has been a lot of change lately. The market could look pretty volatile, especially in the Toronto and Vancouver markets in particular. They're volatile markets. What would you tell someone today? Is this a good time to buy, or is this? Would you wait a couple months just to see which way the market is going? What's your advice?
The best time to buy is when it makes sense for you and your family. So I know it sounds a little bit pat, but trying to time markets as if you're buying a stock is to me a bit of a fool's game. You're going to be paying rent anyways. If you want to own your home, that typically people hang on to their homes for about 7 years. When you're younger, you may turn over a little bit sooner, and when you're older, a little bit longer. But 7 years is a Canadian average, and so whether prices are rising by 1%, falling by 1%, or up by 24%, when you hold it for that 7-year period, it's going to be very different. And remember, unlike other kinds of appreciating assets, we're consuming houses as we live in them. We need clothes on our back, we need food, and we need shelter. So we're going to be paying for a place to live anyway.
So it's not strictly an investment.
It's not. It's consumption. We're consuming housing, and so be cautious. Make sure you don't overextend yourself. Talk to your mortgage advisor and your realtor and understand what you can afford.
So I guess that leads to the question of if I'm trying to think about now versus, say, September, October, as opposed to now versus never. The market is, your point is the market's not going to change that much in a 2-month period.
No. You know what? If we take all the volatility that we see in the markets over the last couple of years out of play, the best deals you can possibly get are in the dead of winter. It's like buying a car. The problem is it's also when the fewest homes are for sale. And unlike a car, that Honda Fit you buy in December or January is the same car you would have bought in May. If the home you want isn't for sale in December or January, it's just not for sale. So the spike in homes available for sale comes in the spring. It's also when people tend to pay a little bit more. but there's lots of choice in Canadian cities, and it allows people to get into their new homes and be prepared for the fall if they have kids and that sort of thing.
Okay, we have another question.
Yes, this is a question from A.K. Aminzai. In BC, where it's already next to impossible to buy, how will it help the average buyer when government introduces stricter mortgage rules and now higher interest rates?
So the interest rate, let me deal with the interest rate side. Housing is a small part, well, a significant, but only a portion of the reason that central banks turn to monetary policy. What they're really trying to do is help the economy overall. They don't want inflation to get a hold, because inflation is the great killer of personal wealth. When inflation enters your life, like when I was a young guy and I bought my first house in the late 80s, inflation was high, and all the money I spent on my mortgage went to interest because interest rates were so high. We live in a blessed time for homeownership where interest rates are so low. You know that for the very first time in Canadian history, over the last 18 months, the line, if you can imagine a line with your mortgage payments and you've got principal and interest. For years, we paid more more interest and less principal. But as interest rates got lower and lower, those lines crossed for the very first time, and we're actually, as a nation, collectively paying more in principal to banks, in other words, more to ourselves, and less in interest. It's never happened in history, and that's why you get that 75% equity number. So it's a very lucky time. That's the answer on the interest rate side. The other things, I have great sympathy for those who make public policy. There's no easy solutions to housing policy in terms of taxation and things. I do think governments sometimes get heavy-handed and they put in policies that are for now, and they don't think about what about 2 years from now when the market changes. But I do think, and I'll turn on the Ontario example. We've got the City of Toronto, the province of Ontario, and the federal government, who have all agreed that they will work collaboratively to create an integrated housing policy with very long-term views. And I think that's what we need right across the country. It's no different than public transit. There are no easy solutions. You need to take a long-term view, and you have to be persistent and look for ways to introduce affordable housing into all our cities.
So there's debate now about whether the federal government could go further and do another rate hike in the fall. Yeah. I'm just curious, I know this isn't your call to make, and it's not mine either, but do you think that if you could advise the Bank of Canada, do you think another rate hike would be too much for this market right now with all of the other policy changes?
I think the big driver behind the rate hike decision, people are talking about at the October meeting would be the next obvious place, will be wage inflation. If salaries and wages start spinning up above that magic 2 to 3% range, there would be a lot of pressure on policymakers to raise interest rates again.
But what would that do to the housing market?
Well, every time money gets more expensive, housing is a very interest rate sensitive market. I will say though, we're still at 0.5%. We were on life support interest rates. It was so low, and it gave the bank no room to manage a crisis. Right? I mean, you're very close to zero. So by moving it up to something more reasonable, and you could go a lot higher than 0.75, that's still, in historical terms,
less than 1%.
really, really, really low interest rates. So there's room for interest rates to rise over the next couple of years. And remember, when interest rates are rising, it is time to break out the champagne, because it means Canada's on a roll. The only reason we're able to raise interest rates right now, or the Bank of Canada is raising interest rates, is because the economy is so strong. Employment's going to improve, wages and salaries are going to improve, the economy is firing on all cylinders. And if it wasn't, we'd still be on those life support level interest rates.
Well, you made a comment to me yesterday that some people might actually read good things into an interest rate increase, in that we're finally not standing on the brink of recession for the first time in 7 years. It
is an interesting hypothesis. There's no rational reason that home prices went up by 24% year over year in Toronto. There's no economic reason, there's no supply and demand. People tried to blame it on foreign investment. Less than 5% of the transactions, a few hundred transactions in the entire Golden Horseshoe. It's not that. So there's a bit of a crowd mentality that happens sometimes that gets people overexcited. I called it irrationally exuberant, and that's exactly what it is. But in the back of their mind, they're thinking, you know, I've been on a run at the dice table, and I've been throwing a lot of whatever's good. Sevens? I don't know. Whatever's good in dice, and I had a winning throws for a long time. This can't last. And it's got to mean something's wrong. And I think that 0.5, that 0.5%, the life support level interest rates, conveyed a little bit of that. Because if we go back over the last 4 or 5 years, all our major banks, the big forecasters, all had, in each and every one of the last few years, they all had an interest rate increase. It's pretty hilarious. I sit down with them beginning of the year, and they're in the third and fourth quarter, and interest rates are going to rise. And another year goes by, it doesn't happen. Another year goes by. Canadians are not, they hear this, and they wonder, there must be something that the Governor of Bank of Canada, that those really in the know that we don't know. Maybe there is another recession. Maybe there's things we should be really worried about. So the fact that for the first time in 7 years, the Bank of Canada has been able to bump up, ever so modestly, interest rates, I believe, for a significant number of Canadians, they'll feel like I do. Must mean the economy's working.
Okay, I think we might have another question.
This is from Rosaline Joyal-Guillot. Greater Montreal seems to be doing quite well. What do you forecast in terms of real estate activity for the next few years? How does Montreal compare to other major Canadian cities?
Great question. You know, if I go back to the end of 2015, I was asked for this, looking at the last year's market, was asked, what do you foresee for the whole Canadian market? And I said, the most likely to over-succeed, the most likely to deliver beyond expectations is the Quebec and Montreal market, and it did. In fact, last year, unemployment finally reached the level it was 40 years ago when the first Parti Québécois government was elected. And for the first time in my memory, the unemployment rate in Quebec is quite a bit lower than the national average. The house prices in Montreal are up 6% year over year. That is total Goldilocks territory. Not too hot, not too cold. Building is occurring. We've got a healthy level of immigration in the city. If you go to Montreal, it feels a lot like Toronto. Horrible traffic because everywhere is building and busy and bustling. It's a great place and a great time for the economy, and honestly, a much healthier market than Toronto has been, which has been unhealthy. It's been skewed so far in favor of the seller, and of course most sellers end up being buyers.
But can Montreal keep going like this?
Oh, I think so. If you look at the government's put together at least 2 balanced budgets, which in Canadian provincial terms is pretty amazing. The reinvestment in the province, the export activity coming out of Quebec is really strong. A lot of the things that are driving the Ontario economy are doing so in Quebec as well. But there's one big difference. Homes there cost $400,000 on average instead of $840,000 on average like they do in Toronto. Montreal may be the biggest bargain in global class cities. It is a huge deal. It wasn't that long ago. Homes in Montreal on average were cheaper than St. John's, Newfoundland.
Oh, now I want one.
Yeah.
We do have another question from Cameron Goldberg. I'm a recent condo buyer. With rising interest rates, should I expect my property value to continue to go up as interest rates rise? Will the increasing rates stunt or halt property prices into the downtown core? Cameron is in Toronto.
So condominiums have not appreciated at the same crazy rate as detached properties have. And the main reason is, in a city like Toronto, and in fact, even in a city like Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, it's easier to go up than it is to go out. It's expensive to sprawl. You need fire stations and roads and garbage pickup and road maintenance. Whereas going up is a very efficient use of municipal resources. And a big thing is we can control supply much better than we can in detached homes. So yes, home prices, condominium home prices have been rising too, but not at the same rate that detached homes have. And they won't likely have the same level of decline in a down market that detached homes, because you have overshooting. When you're looking at detached homes, which are in very, very tight supply, you can get some of that irrational exuberance and overshoot, and the market takes a while to
We've already seen some
adjust.
of that in the last 2 months.
Yeah.
Detached homes have declined.
At a greater rate.
Yep.
Yeah. So I remember back in 2012, I received a barrage of questions around the huge overbuilding of condominiums in Toronto. And I said at the time, I said, yeah, we look like there's a lot of oversupply, but in a couple of years, you come back and ask me, and we'll be talking about a condo shortage. It didn't even take that. It was like 18 months, and we'd sopped up all the supply. All you have to do is walk down that corridor westward from the Air Canada Centre and look at the thousands and thousands of new people, mostly young people, working high-tech jobs in that cool corridor there between the lake and the financial district, and you realize just how vibrant this city is.
So maybe there's time to ask you about one more market in Canada,
Sure.
which is Calgary.
Yeah.
It's been so, it's been down
Yeah.
in the last few years. Everybody knows about Alberta's economic issues. What do you think? What's your forecast going
Okay, well, Calgary's my hometown, so I grew up there. And on Calgary, when I was growing up, the favorite bumper sticker was, "Please, Lord, let there be another oil boom. I promise not to piss it away this time." And certainly, they are no strangers to boom and bust economies. The unexpected collapse of oil prices in 2014 caught Canada's hottest housing market and hottest economy completely flat-footed. And it was devastating. It's been a difficult 30 months for the province with unemployment rates that have been unheard of in contemporary times. But man, are they coming back. They will either be the fastest growing province this year or second fastest. And I don't want to be too optimistic. When I say man, are they coming back? They're growing quickly, but off a very low base. So I don't want to overstate
You're talking about
the
house
recovery.
prices coming
The
back.
economy
Okay.
and house prices are a bit of a trailing indicator in this case. So it's the unemployment rate is clicking down. We're seeing a return to stability, a return to net migration into the province. And the housing market turned the corner in about the third or fourth quarter of last year. So we saw last year home prices in Calgary, for example, up 2.5%. At the half, we're at 5% year over year, and we believe it'll hang on to about that number. So continue to grow through 2017, and year over year about 5% up.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Phil, and thank you for everyone who participated and watched our broadcast today. And please keep tuning in to more of our Facebook Lives.